let me say, a word in defense of reason in dialogue with faith.
Because faith is that proof. Faith unites us to that substance.
But reason, in order to realize its full potential, needs the horizons revealed by and truths contained in the faith. And not just any faith, but the Catholic faith.
But now we have this question. So we got sort of what differentiates romantic love is that there's some kind of connection to sexual union. But what is this sexual union? Well, sex is going to be a crucial part of the story. But why should sex, this organ meeting with that organ in that way, help fulfill the yearnings of a basic form of love? I mean, it's sort of weird. Why should this bit of flesh, touching that bit of flesh in that way, have anything to do with love? Presumably, the real union in a basic form of love has to be something non-trivial, something significant. We don't have any basic natural form of love that is consummated by tracing a circle on the back of the other person's hand. So what aspect of sex gives sex the kind of significance that makes it a fit way for mature romantic love to unite? Is it because it's pleasant? Is it because it produces emotional closeness, physical contact, reproduction? Well, pleasure and emotional closeness can be had in entirely unromantic and non-sexual contexts, also, right? Nor is sexual pleasure or the emotional closeness that results from sex necessarily always more intense than other pleasures or other kinds of closeness. Other kinds of closeness and pleasure may be more intense. A particular instance of sex might be either more or less intensely pleasurable than a particular instance of intellectual conversation, or even a particular instance of eating cake together. Likewise, the emotional closeness that can result from sex need not be greater than other instances of emotional closeness. It might be sometimes, at other times it might not be. And while the lovers might sometimes be disappointed if reproduction doesn't occur, their sexual union still has significance without reproduction. There still seems to be a real union for which the lovers yearned. So if there's a connection to reproduction, it cannot be a simple one. What if, but the suggestion is physical contact? Well, if we say the physical contact is what makes sex be the right kind of real union for romantic relationships, we're being too vaguely euphemistic to be helpful. Physical contact occurs in all kinds of activities. Wrestlers wrestle, siblings hug, good Samaritans carry the wounded, and so on. That something like physical contact is important in sex seems exactly right. But what matters is the particular kind of contact. Well, what particular kind is that? Well, we could try to define it in terms of contact with body parts from a certain list. If you look at the Paula Jones and Bill Clinton stuff, the lawyers made up a very precise list of body parts and said sex is any contact between this a part on this list and a part on this list that involves sexual pleasure, or any contact between this part and this part, whether it involves sexual pleasure or not. It was very precise. But that's not right. For one, the doctor can make contact with any body part without that being sexual. We could say, well, okay, but it has to be for gratification of sexual desire, or it has to involve arousal. Or maybe we could have a combination view on which certain kinds of contact counts as sex regardless of intention, and certain ones count depending on intention. That was what they did in the Bill Clinton case. But any approaches that involve lists of organs are philosophically very unsatisfactory, for it doesn't answer the question, why should it matter to the lovers that these particular body parts on the list are involved? There's no significant real union in a woman's inserting a finger into a man's ear, though if done affectionately, the act might contribute to union. Why should there be any more significance in intercourse? Well, I want to step back. The problem is to explain what sexual union is and why it matters. We do have a pretty clear intuition that when intercourse occurs in the right circumstances and for the right motivations between a man and a woman, then there is a real union as one flesh that lovers seek. You can pack whatever you like into the right circumstances, like marriage and so on. So maybe we should think about not sex sort of in general, which is a sort of vague term in our culture, but specifically about intercourse and why it is significant. I mean, this is sexual ethics. It may get somewhat graphic. Probably not very. One striking thing about intercourse between a man and a woman is that it involves not just a random pair of organs, in the way that a finger and an ear would be, but a matched and cooperating set of organs. And these organs are matched not simply for geometric reasons. It's not simply that one set fits geometrically with the other in the way that an ear and a finger of exactly the right size could perhaps fit. Rather, the sets of organs are functionally matched. They are organs that are working together in intercourse. But it only makes sense to talk of two systems working together when there's something that they are working for, a goal. What is this goal? Well, if we have to explain to a Martian which organs are involved in intercourse, Martian sees all sorts of pornographic movies and wonders what's going on, or maybe observes humans and wants to know what's going on, and we want to explain intercourse, we have to tell the Martian which organs are involved. Well, I think what we're going to have to say to the Martian is that it's reproductive organs. And the goal of the mutual biological striving, I think, then, which is what defines the way in which these organs count as matches for each other, is reproduction. And here I do need to get slightly more graphic for a brief time. In intercourse, the vagina, which is a muscular, cylindrical organ surrounding a cavity, elicits the ejaculation of potentially sperm-bearing semen from the male through frictional stimulation. What for? Well, the activity is typically pleasant for the man and also often for the woman. But if the organs were working together to produce pleasure, then it would be just a coincidence that potentially sperm-bearing semen is being elicited into the female reproductive system. But that's no coincidence, right? That's the whole point. That's the biological point. Now, that is the biological point. That does not mean that it's the point the couple necessarily cares about most. It might even not be the case that's the point that they should care about most, but it is the biological point. What is happening in intercourse is human mating, right? There's a biological striving in the direction of reproduction. This striving occurs whether or not the couple endorses it, and it occurs even when reproduction is impossible due to temporary or permanent infertility. So intercourse, and we'll have more discussion of that with Pat Lee's comments. So intercourse is an activity of reproductive type. It's an instance of human mating. That's just how humans mate. And now it becomes a little clear why it should matter to the lovers. For there's a value in a bodily striving for a great end, and reproduction is a great end. It is the procreation of a new human person, a being in the image and likeness of God. This value is present in the biological activity of intercourse, and it is present even when the striving cannot be completed. One hasn't wasted one's time when playing a football game if one has lost. One might not even care about victory when one's playing. One might just want to play for the joy of the game. But there is a point to the game, and you wouldn't understand it as playing the game if you didn't pay some attention to the goal, like knowing which way to run. You need to know. An activity of reproductive type is not something trivial, whether it succeeds in reproduction or not. Moreover, we now see that the significance that intercourse between a man and a woman has is a significance that other sexual activities that they may engage in do not have. If what makes intercourse fitting as the physical aspect of the real union that romantic lovers yearn for is the cooperative functioning of the reproductive system, then these other activities do not yield that union because there is no cooperative functioning of the reproductive system. And a consequence of this is that no activity that a man and a man or a woman and a woman could do can fulfill the yearnings of romantic love, though they might think that they have fulfilled them. Let me try a somewhat different approach. Sexual union is a union as one flesh, one body. A union, Scripture tells us this. What's this mean? Well, it seems to mean a union analogous to that which parts of a body have with one another. Now, my heart is not united to the arteries merely by physical contact, or even by the fact that this contact is permanent, right? If a doctor were fixing my heart, he wouldn't glue the arteries to the heart and say, oh, they're joined up. It's not the right kind of joining up. If we glue two cats together, they may be in permanent contact, but they're not living out a union as one body. Rather, I think what biologically unites the heart and the arteries is that they're cooperating together for the joint goal of oxygenating my body. And it's very plausible to understand the organic union of parts of a body biologically as a union defined by the parts working together for a common purpose. Well, if we see sexual union as a union as one body, we're going to see it as a cooperation for a common purpose. What is that striving purpose going to be? Well, it can't be something trivial, for then the sexual union would not be of deep importance. And I think the most plausible candidates for the purpose of this biological striving that unites the two bodies as one are pleasure, psychological unity, and reproduction. If we're talking of a very biological striving, because we're talking of one flesh, and the focus here is on the physicality, then it doesn't seem right to understand the common striving of the bodies in sexual union as being directed at psychological unity. In any case, this need not be the best way to produce psychological unity. It can produce psychological unity, but there are many other ways. What about pleasure? Well, pleasure is not something worthwhile on its own, I think. That's controversial, but I think it's true. It is good to take pleasure in something good. But when you take pleasure in something that is valueless of itself, that's an empty pleasure. That's directing our heart. When we experience pleasure, our heart is directed at something. It experiences something as good. But if it's not good, then we're deceiving ourselves. So pleasure where there is no good would be an empty pleasure. And the lovers are not united as one flesh by bodily striving for an empty pleasure. That just wouldn't have the kind of significance. So if it's pleasure that they're striving at, there has to be something else as well. So pleasure on its own can't be the answer. And that leaves reproduction, which is what we got when I was thinking about intercourse and thinking how I would explain that to the alien. So the two bodies are united by common biological striving for reproduction, and that makes the persons be one flesh. So that is sort of the physical component. But of course, romantic lovers don't just want a biological union. A biological union does not do justice to them as embodied persons. It may be what dogs have, but it's not good enough for persons, beings of rational soul and body. Such beings yearn for a union that does justice to interpersonal love. The physical aspect of the union, which is constituted by the joint striving of the reproductive systems, needs to be in harmony with the attitudes of the two as persons. And I want to talk about two aspects of this harmony. The first aspect is this. If Martha is united to George through their bodies' joint reproductive striving in intercourse, but Martha and George fight against this reproductive striving by taking pills or putting barriers in between, then Martha and George are fighting against what unites them physically. Their bodies may still be united despite their best efforts, but because their wills are opposed to what their bodies are doing, neither of them is united as an integrated person. Martha is disunited from Martha's body and hence from herself. George is disunited from George's body and hence from himself. And because Martha was going to be united with George through their bodies, Martha is disunited from George. Now, it's not necessary for my integration as a person that I positively will everything my body does. Many of the things my body does are things that only doctors know about, and some are not even known to the doctors. But if I make an act of will against what my body does, then I do disunite myself from my body. And if I simultaneously try to unite with another through the very bodily activity that I am opposing, then I have disunited myself from the other person in disuniting myself from my body, while in a kind of sort of self-contradictory way, trying to unite with them. So an act of sexual intercourse, in order to help constitute the kind of romantic union that love seeks, which isn't merely biological, but also involves the persons, has to be open to life. This is at least a negative condition. The couple should not do anything to oppose the reproductive striving. They cannot fight that which unites them if it's going to be an integrated, real union of persons. So this is sort of on the side of mechanics and intentions. Not just mechanics, but it's also intentions. They cannot direct their hearts against what their bodies are doing if they want to unite through their bodies. The second aspect has to do with time. The union of parts in an organism has a dimension of time. Typically, the major parts of an organism are united with one another for their lifetime. My heart had better last me a lifetime. Maybe we can occasionally, find transplants and things, but those are exceptional cases. There may be a few parts that we lose. So for instance, I take the controversial judgment that the placenta is a part of the fetus, and so it's a part that the fetus loses eventually. It's a part that's not needed after one is born. But most parts aren't like that. Most parts persist over a lifetime. So there's a temporal dimension that is needed to make intercourse more fully a union analogous to that of parts of one organism. Because if you just look at intercourse by itself, it only lasts a certain amount of time. Not anywhere close in the order of magnitude to the lifetime of the organisms. So there needs to be a temporal dimension. Moreover, human persons exist through time. And their union as persons needs a temporal dimension. The brief act of intercourse can be, as it were, stretched through time by means of a uniquely personal act, an act of loving commitment, of a promise to one another. In this case, a loving commitment for life, indeed a marriage. There's sort of this idea that commitment is one of the things that makes us uniquely human, is I think, a really powerful one. I got it actually from Nietzsche. Nietzsche says, man became an interesting animal when he became capable of making promises. And Nietzsche's thought is, it's this amazing power that promises have, where you can control your very own future actions. Normally, I can just will what I'm going to do now. I can have intentions for the future, but I could change my mind. But a promise takes away my right to change my mind. It lets me control sort of myself over time. It's an amazing power, and Nietzsche thinks that's what gave rise to sort of the interesting aspects of human society. Now, I think, I don't think that's all of it. I think one doesn't want to say that's. I don't want to be one of those people who say you have people who say the human being is a rational animal. You have John Paul who basically is saying the human being is a giving animal. I don't want to say the human being is a promising animal. I think all of these are important aspects of human beings. But they are all, but the promising one is very important. And so through a commitment, human beings can unite for life. And this commitment would involve a commitment to being united as one flesh on reasonable occasions with this person and with no other persons while both are alive. And this makes the union a personal union of one flesh until death doth part. So I've briefly sketched an approach to sexual ethics that starts with general considerations about love and then concludes to an understanding of specifically romantic love as a love that seeks a real union of two persons as one organism in a loving, lifelong commitment through a personally integrated reproductive striving. Let me read that again. A real union of two persons as one organism in a loving, lifelong commitment through a personally integrated reproductive striving. It follows from the analysis that various sexual acts other than intercourse, whether because they're of the wrong sort or because they lack the interpersonal dimensions of commitment and integration, are not what romantic love yearns for. I haven't argued here that those things are wrong. That would take more work, and I try to do that in my One Body book. I'm just trying to offer a basic framework for sexual ethics, a framework that takes seriously the idea that romantic love is a form of love defined by a particular kind of union. But I also want to offer this framework as a model, not just for sexual ethics, but for the way that you can use an ethics of love to arrive at specific moral conclusions. You start with the general concept of love, then you specify the particular forms of love that are relevant to a given case, and finally you analyze these forms. I mean, it would be really interesting to see what would you get out of just war theory if you tried to do this. What are the relevant forms of love for a just war theory? Love of enemy, love of neighbor, love of authorities for those that they are to serve under them, and then analyze what follows from these forms of love.